Hey there, folks. This is one of those shows that you don't hear on other programs because I have the joy and the freedom to talk to people that you're just not going to hear on other programs, at least as far as I can tell. One of those people at the top of the list is Margarita Mooney, now Margarita Mooney Suarez, recently married. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Who has been on the program before. Margarita, let me just tell people you're an associate professor of practical theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. That says it all in a nutshell. You're the founder of the Scala Foundation. We've discussed that in the past. You have a new book out. I want to talk to you about the book, and I just love this. It's called The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. This is, you can talk about this yourself, but I will say that, a lot of times I think people are sick, really sick of kind of breaking news, what's going on right this minute. We need to step back, and we do that not infrequently on this program, to talk about the big questions, to help us to process life and how we deal with the moment, so to speak. And that's one of the reasons I was excited to get you in here in the studio to talk about the book, The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. So let me ask you the question that I've answered in my own way. Why did you feel led to write this book, The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education? What is your thinking?
Well, Eric, I began my work on this book actually right around the time that the lockdown started for the COVID pandemic. And I don't know if you or maybe some of our listeners are familiar with C.S. Lewis's essay, Learning in Wartime.
Oh my gosh. Listen, you don't know this, but I've been very recently immersed in Lewis and that kind of thing. And you're quite right. That sums up at least what I'm thinking about and what I know you're thinking about, because you just brought it up. So please have at it.
Well, he says, and this is one of my favorite quotes, I'm paraphrasing him here. He says that if humans had postponed the search for beauty and truth until human life was settled and calm, we never would have begun the journey, right? So he's speaking to students at Oxford just as World War II is breaking out. He has served as a soldier in the trenches in World War I and has seen a lot of destruction. And he's saying that the search for beauty and the search for truth, although it sounds really abstract, is actually incredibly practical and essential to human life. And I wrote this book during a difficult time in this country because I wanted people to recover the tradition of beauty and the forms of beauty that open us up, pierce through ideology, can resist totalitarianism, and draw us toward the absolute. Little did I know that writing this book would actually lead me a year later to meet my husband, David Clayton, who is an iconographer and has a book, it's kind of funny, he has a book called The Way of Beauty. So I published this book as Margarita Mooney Suarez, but very shortly after that I became Margarita Mooney Clayton. So I have gone by several different names.
That's what I meant, right.
Anyone who's from a Hispanic background can understands the use of 2 last names and how names change. I have a really funny essay on my name changing on my website.
And forgive me for missing the Clayton part, but I had the privilege of meeting your husband at a recent Socrates in the City event. But I want to say to people clearly that goodness, truth, and beauty, these things lead us to God.
Precisely.
And these things lead us to each other. Beauty leads to goodness and truth. Goodness leads to truth and beauty. So any temptation that somebody has to say beauty, that's a non-essential, that's like saying the church is non-essential. You are mistaken. If you do not understand what is good and true and beautiful, if you aren't thinking about this, or if you aren't somehow innately drawn to these things or innately moving along the lines of truth, goodness, and beauty, you can't possibly know how to react in the moment when there's a war, an ideological war within your own culture, whether there's an actual war like World War II. So these things help us really to be human and to process what's going on. And I just want to make that case. Obviously, Lewis makes the case brilliantly. You're making the case. But I just want to say to people, beware of the siren song of the urgent and the immediate, because that will lead you into error. There's just no way around it. It would lead you to error. It will lead you to the rocks. And we have to make time, just as we make time to brush our teeth and to do daily devotions or to whatever it is, take out the trash. You've got to do those things. Otherwise, eventually, everything falls apart.
Precisely. And I think this is an incredibly important time for us in the United States of America to recover the traditions of beauty, upon which this country was founded. But I'll also share with you, Eric, that part of the reason I care about this so much was that when I was in my 20s and I was trying to understand the differences between the United States and countries in Latin America, my mother being from Cuba, I went on several trips to Cuba. And on the second trip, I was able to go with my mother. This was 1999. And after 40 years of the Cuban government telling people that the Cubans who had left needed to be kept separate from the Cubans who had stayed and had been faithful to the revolution, we broke through that to go see the people where my mom had grown up. And when we got to the village where she had grown up, the church, which her family had helped to build, had been turned into a movie theater and eventually abandoned. But as we're talking to the people in the village, first they brought out little baptismal cards or communion cards. They had kept memories of the people who left. But then this one man came to us and said, "Come to my backyard, I have something to show you." And underneath a pile of wood, wrapped in canvas and covered and hidden, he had saved 2 stained glass windows about 6 by 8 feet that he had kept hidden for 40 years. Now, I've heard stories of people hiding chalices and icons and things like that, but we're talking stained glass windows. Why did this man hold on to those windows for 40 years? Because he had hope and because he had faith. And a woman whose name is Esperanza, which literally means hope, asked my mom if her family could work with them to reopen this church. And they did. And the windows went back in.
I mean, that's a story, Margarita. That's amazing. This stuff is haunting because your family has a history with the satanic communists, understands how evil that is. You bring a perspective. Mm-hmm. My mother, with whom I spoke this morning, grew up in first Nazi Germany and then Stalinist Soviet-occupied East Germany. My father was in Greece when the communists tried to take over. When you have family history of the evil of communism, because communism is anti-God, which ultimately you and I know is anti-beauty, anti-truth, anti-goodness. It is wickedness itself kind of wrapped up into a political ideology. So when you've lived it and seen it, and now you've traveled there, it becomes real, and we become voices of hope to people to say, hey, listen, folks, evil is real, and we need to fight for goodness, truth, and beauty. These aren't incidental things that we made up.
No, and Eric, it's really interesting. What was on the windows that were hidden for 40 years was the Blessed Mother with the child Jesus surrounded by roses, and then Jesus on the cross. But what was really interesting was that my mother noticed not only were the stained glass windows gone, the rose garden was gone. So what happened in communist Cuba when they shut all the churches and expelled all the priests and closed all the Catholic schools? Well, people stopped gardening roses because in the communist ideology, the only thing that matters is material production to satisfy our basic needs.
You can't eat roses. Kill them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So people stopped gardening. And then shortly after people stopped gardening, guess what else they stopped doing? Working. The sugar mill, where my mother had grown up, also got closed. Right? So people think, worship is incidental, it's secondary, what's really primary is production. Well, when you take away worship and you take away beauty, and all you're left with is material production.
Oh, no. We're just getting started, folks. I'm getting hot under the collar. We'll be right back. Folks, I'm talking to Margarita Mooney Suarez Clayton, de Garcia y Vega, or something like that. I don't know. Margarita, again, for folks who are unaware, you are officially an associate professor of practical theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. You've got all kinds of encomia and degrees and accomplishments, but you are sitting here as the author of a new book, The Wounds of Beauty. The Wounds of Beauty. And what you just said as we went to the break, this sums it up. And I'm just, almost cracking up because I've been talking about this the last few days. I've been talking, what you just brought up. I'm editing the transcript of a Socrates in the City conversation that I did with Tom Howard. The great, 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 great Tom Howard. Thomas Howard passed away about a year ago, who wrote one of the greatest books I've ever read called Chancer the Dance. And he is making this case in 1969 about, it's exactly what we're talking about, this idea that there are two views of the world. One of them is this biblical idea that goodness, truth, and beauty are essential. And the opposite idea, this modernist, bleak, atheistic idea, which is really the idea that the communists force on their populations, is so anti-human that it leads to death of every kind. It says that flowers aren't important. It says that beauty isn't important. And just look at their architect is grotesque. I mean, their architecture is grotesque. It's all just bleak, modernist, brutalist architecture. Everywhere you look in that world, it's a world without God. And it's so fascinating to me that here you are saying that in Cuba, they don't just shut down the church, but that they stopped planting roses. I mean, that is...
It's symbolic of the larger point, which is that, look, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, Wounds of Beauty, I did it as a series of dialogues because it's hard for people who haven't had the time to read a lot on the history of ideas or philosophy to understand these points we're trying to make, that beauty is essential. But one of the tropes about beauty that's not true is that beauty is only for the elites, that somehow high culture is only for people who have a lot of money. But the point I'm trying to make is the opposite, that what we believe as people of faith is that God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, and therefore we're called to sanctify matter. And so we not only create things that we need to satisfy our bodily needs, but we co-create with God, and we create order in the cosmos because God created nature, he created us, and he gave us the capacity to co-create and bring order out of chaos. And so I wrote this book during the time of the COVID lockdowns when there were a lot of protests going on in the United States and a lot of violence happening in our own country, which really dismayed me, because I wanted people to have hope and to see that these ideas about beauty that I'm talking about are actually really practical for how you should live your life from a place of hope, the importance of beauty to help you understand patterns and therefore know what your own calling and your own vocation is, to create a society based on order, not a society based on the idea that all we can ever do is fight against our oppressors and, try to save the victims. Well, when you're done saving the victims and fighting the oppressors, where is it you're trying to lead people?
Right. Well, those kinds of people aren't trying to lead people anywhere. They haven't thought it through, but we need to think it through. We need to think through what kind of a culture do we want to live in? And I just want to be clear. The book, The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education, you found 7 people with whom you had a dialogue on this issue from different angles. I recognize some of the names. Francis Meyer, haven't seen him in a number of years, but just love him. Dana Gioia, we had him at Socrates in the City talking about poetry some years ago. I noticed the name David Clayton is in the book.
That's correct.
Can you tell us about this?
So David Clayton is an iconographer. He is a kind of revert to Christianity after studying material science at Oxford and kind of going down a path of atheism, felt a lot of darkness. And he recounts in this book how he just became dissatisfied with the material comforts of the world and was seeking something deeper. He got some advice and he followed his call to become an artist. And it was art that drew him back to God. And he decided to study this lost tradition of iconography. And so here he is, this kind of revert to Christianity, doing iconography in the UK.
Now, when you say iconography, do we mean iconography in the Roman Catholic tradition, in the Orthodox tradition? What tradition? I mean, because I only know iconography to the extent that I do in the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
So he learned with a Greek Orthodox painter named Aidan Hart, who was a recent speaker at the Scala conference, who paints in the Greek Orthodox tradition. David also paints, so he paints Greek, but he also will paint Italian, Sienese style, Romanesque style, and also kind of neo-Gothic icons. So, but what is interesting about his story and what I'm trying to do in The Wounds of Beauty, I talked to philosophers, I talked to the historian Peter Brown, but I have become really interested in how artists themselves understand their calling to co-create with God, and what does that mean to them. And so David Clayton, who later on became my husband, he explains that really what happens in art schools so often is that artists are taught to be innovative and to express themselves. But he wanted to learn from tradition, and he wanted to learn from the great masters, and he wanted somebody to guide him. And so what he's actually arguing is that I think in order to renew culture, we need to help artists understand that it's not their job to express themselves. It's their job to express the truth.
We're dealing with an at least 200-year-old problem here, right? I mean, the Romantic movement, early part of the 19th century, this philosophy developed that in the end, and this is ironic and fascinating, it leads to the end of beauty. It leads to a war on beauty. When you think about 20th century modernism and postmodernism, it is at war with the traditional ideas of beauty. If something is traditionally beautiful, they sneer at it, they mock it, they act as though it's not as sophisticated as my, Rothko or Motherwell or whatever it is. It's the tradition of art, not just the visual arts, but poetry. All you need to do is think of the quote-unquote music of John Cage. It is like a mockery of beauty. It's a mockery of poetry. It's a mockery of art. And at the end of the day, I don't know if you would go so far as to say this, but I certainly do, it is a war on God. Representational art, to paint a beautiful mother and child, to paint a beautiful landscape. These things are homages in their way to the ultimate beauty of God. And something happened, where as you go through Impressionism all the way to the other side, that it became, people look at, I mentioned Longfellow all the time, but people looked at that kind of poetry that everyone might appreciate, or the kind of paintings that everyone might appreciate. They sneered at it, as though if it's not for the cognoscenti, if it's not for the elites, then it's somehow pathetic, it's somehow corny. That's part of what we're dealing with here, is recapturing this ancient, eternal idea of beauty.
Precisely. And so I begin the book with a conversation with the historian Peter Brown, who is an historian and a biographer of St. Augustine. And so he describes, through Augustine's encounter with beauty, right? Many people who've read the Confessions are familiar with this line, "Late have I loved thee, ever ancient and ever new." And what Augustine is saying there was that he had learned in ancient philosophy that, the Platonic forms were these kind of spiritualized, disembodied, that beauty was this kind of ethereal, spiritual other. But it was through Christianity and the doctrine of the Incarnation that he realized that, no, beauty is God coming to meet us in this world. And that one idea changes everything. Now, fast forward many centuries, what ends up happening, as you mentioned, with the Romantic movement, is that they wanted to sever beauty as the being of God expressing itself in the world, communicating to us. They wanted to make beauty a subjective, emotional experience, which was the beginning of all the other problems.
Okay, so this is, I guess, you get the Byronic idea of the artist, right? Somehow it's about me. I am the artist. I am expressing myself, which, as you're saying, that's a radical break from everything.
It's a radical break. And one of the best moments of my recent conference on art, the sacred, and the common good was when the iconographer from Quebec named Jonathan Pajot said, "The beginning of my career as an artist was when I stopped trying to express myself. Because the purpose of an artist is to express truth and beauty and goodness. And if you're going to do that, you have to know the traditions that have come before you, because great artists stand on the shoulders of great masters."
This is, ladies and gentlemen, in case you want to know what's really important, this conversation is really important. Much more with Margarita Mooney, Suarez, Clayton, Garcia, Y Vega, et cetera, et cetera. The book is The Wounds of Beauty. Hey, folks, the book is The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. The author, Margarita Mooney Suarez Clayton. People can remember The Wounds of Beauty. They'll find you. So you literally met your husband because you were writing this book. You start talking to this iconographer, David Clayton, and next thing you know, your last name is Clayton.
You know, I would hope that my story gives a little bit of hope to some of our listeners, because David and I were single well into our 40s, and for him into his 50s. And I'll tell the truth about how I met him was that a spiritual director of mine and a friend convinced me to do online dating, Catholic Match. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be so boring. Well, in the summertime, I went out to California to do some work out there with a couple different universities, and a friend said, "Oh, change your location to San Francisco. You never know." And I changed my location, which changed what happened in the feed. And this guy writes to me who says, "I do a lot of culture and art, and sounds like you're really interested in that too. I'd love to meet for coffee." And that's how I met my husband. The funny thing was, we wondered why we hadn't met in professional circles.
Right.
And I think maybe it was a God thing that we were meant to establish a personal relationship before a professional one. Because as a professional woman, in a professional setting, you don't try to get personal with the men you're working with, because it just feels inappropriate. So it was actually really appropriate that we met through this seemingly impersonal way that allowed us to be really personal. But we immediately discovered that we shared a passion for bringing into the present these wonderful traditions, and that we really shared a sense of urgency. Like, this is the most important thing that our culture needs to understand. And he's unique because as an iconographer, he's also written several books on the history of art and culture, trying to make the argument that recovering these traditions, as I do, is the way to transform our society, and it's the way to transform our politics. But why is that? Like, this is the hardest point I have getting across to people. Precisely before the break, we were saying people tend to think beauty is personal and emotional. So it's a jump for people to think that beauty is actually central to what we do as a community, or central to what we do as a political community. But beauty, by which I mean, the fine arts and art and music and poetry, which anybody is capable of making in, they invite us to participate in something that is bigger than us. And my experiences, as I mentioned, in Cuba, but I've also traveled through Haiti. I've worked with former soldiers in Central America. My experience time and again is that precisely political ideology wants to tell you, you can't connect to that person because you have a different skin color, or because you're from a different class background, or because you speak a different language. But, everywhere I've been, Eric, I can sing with people. I can worship with people. I can help make a meal. And so what I realized was that sharing in beauty is how we generate common goods. The common good is not some sort of quantifiable metric that we split up equally amongst people. No, it's something that we come together, each with our God-given gifts in a diversity of ways, and we co-create the common good. So this understanding of beauty is all about a culture of abundance, because God's love is pouring into creation eternally, all the time. It hasn't stopped. Whereas what political ideology tells us is, hey, we have to take from some to give to the others, or we have to come up with
some kinds of political ideology. That's basically it's the liberal big state idea that it's a zero-sum game, and that in order to help the poor, we've got to take the rich down a notch. We've got to tax them more. It's the opposite of the way the free market is supposed to work, where the rising tide lifts all boats. But it is a zero-sum game, and it's very bleak. And it's fundamentally, I mean, this is, we see it now in cultural Marxism, but we saw it in economic Marxism. It is constantly keeping people at war with other people, that you always have to have an enemy, an oppressor and an oppressed. And what you're saying is that God's vision doesn't work that way.
Look, you just named it. One of the problems with our culture today is that other people are fundamentally seen as a threat to me somehow. Our identity, our very understanding of ourself, is seen as in opposition to other people. And this is a fundamental problem. But what I've seen time and again in my travels throughout Latin America, which I mentioned, but also with my students that I work with at Princeton Theological Seminary and through Scala Foundation, we need to be creating something that invites everybody to participate from their different backgrounds, not obliterating the social differences we have or the economic differences. Those don't go away. But our identity needs to be founded in something that is beyond us, not in something that is a threat to us, that we're just, as you mentioned earlier, reactive to. And so beauty, there's a great term I've been writing about for a piece I'm going to publish in Comment magazine on devotion to the Blessed Mother. And there's a musical term called the fugue. And there's a writer from England, Carol Houselander, who's written about Mary like a fugue. Well, what's a fugue? A fugue is a series of repetitive parts of music that then interweave, right? So think about musical harmony. Musical harmony isn't devoid of tension, and it's certainly not devoid of different voices. But all those things come together to produce a harmony, but they're also repeated and moving towards something. So this idea of the fugue is how I think about culture. We come together with our different gifts, but we have to bring harmony out of our difference, and we have to be moving towards something. Otherwise, we get locked inside of ourselves. We get this buffered self, as Charles Taylor called it. And that, Eric, that buffered self is a place of darkness, and it's a place of fear.
The buffered self. What a horrible idea. I'm glad you mentioned it. We're going to be right back, folks. We're talking about the book, The Wounds of Beauty. Welcome back. We're talking with the author of the book, The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. I mentioned I know some of the folks who are part of this book. Dana Gioia, who we had at Socrates and City a number of years ago, who is a poet and who has written extensively on poetry. He wrote this shocking cover article in the Atlantic Monthly. I don't know if it's 20 years ago now. Can Poetry Matter? And he wrote a book basically because he takes the traditional Christian view and he's way more generous to certain people than I would be. He doesn't sneer as hard, but the idea that beauty matters, that the tradition of average people being able to hear poetry and memorize poetry and understand poetry, that's important, and that went away. I was referring earlier to Longfellow, how when I was at Yale, I was taught to sneer at anything that rhymed, to sneer at Longfellow, to sneer at Norman Rockwell, to sneer at anything that was traditionally beautiful, to sneer at anything that might reach the masses, so to speak, and not just the elites. And there's an ideology there that so Dana Gioia is part of what he tries to do, and I just want to talk about him now, and I know we can do another show. But trying to restore poetry in the same way that you and your husband are talking about visual beauty and visual art, these are central to culture. If you want to know why everything's gone to hell, you can trace it. It's just fascinating to me.
Absolutely. I think, look, it took me a while to realize this. I studied psychology at Yale in the 90s, and I did my PhD in sociology at Princeton. And I was afraid of talking about beauty because it would sound like either I'm superficial and care a lot about appearance and, attractiveness, or that the fact that I liked Gothic architecture more than sort of modern brutalist architecture somehow signified that I was elitist.
Right.
And so I never encountered these topics.
Well, wait a minute. I find it's so ironic because on the one hand, they would say you're being elitist, and the people who are, advocating for cinder block, Soviet-style housing, they act like we're for the people. And the irony is only elites could be dumb enough to prefer that ugly stuff and think they're doing it for the people. And that when they accuse somebody who appreciates traditional beauty of being elitist, that there's just tremendous irony because the average person, in fact, the non-elites prefer the kind of beauty that you and I are talking about.
I think all human beings
That's what
do.
I mean, yeah.
And there's also this trope that building beautiful buildings is more expensive than building cinder block ones. That's not true.
I believe Judas was the one who said that in the Gospels. Go ahead.
Well, because I think as I discussed in the chapter with David Clayton, the principles of beauty and architecture, it's really about proportion and harmony, right? So it's not about the cost of the materials. It's a question of design, right? So these principles of harmony, clarity, that I talk about also with Dana Gioia, those are universal principles that people of any income or educational background can perceive and can make. So of course, when I was actually recently in the Princeton University chapel, beautiful structure. Princeton University, sadly, has put up some pretty brutalist dorm buildings. And I was talking to the men who are maintaining the university chapel, and they were just saying, it looks like a jail. Why did they build those things?
Of course it does.
And so, the fact is that human beings are made to perceive harmony. And what you see in cinder block architecture is not harmony, it's sameness. It's this kind of, it's a kind of repetition that has no harmony to it. So remember a moment ago I talked about music, that it's actually the different notes come together and make a whole that's more beautiful than the individual parts. Well, the idea that beauty is simply taking one square shape and repeating it 100,000 times, no, that's not what traditional architecture was about.
I mean, look, there's this famous line, you know this better than I do, but the famous Yale professor, Vincent Scully, he said famously, talking about, this is a classic example, it's like the classic example, that the old Penn Station was this glorious building, ennobling, beautiful. People would walk into it, and without even knowing why, it would just lift their spirits, and it would just be a beautiful place. Then they tore it down, and they built this disgusting rat warren along the lines of, and Vincent Scully famously said that one strode into the old Penn Station like a god. One scuttles into the new Penn Station like a rat. That ultimately is what we're talking about. Beauty does something to us because we're not just atoms. We're not just animals. We have souls. God created us in his image. And so when people say, no, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that you get enough vodka and bread and shelter. That's enough for you. They are redefining human beings as less than what God says we are.
Precisely. And look, there are many examples of these beautiful kind of architecture in public housing that still survive, for example, in England, in hospitals, and in police stations. Here in New York, down at South Ferry, it was a beautiful building. It was a ferry stop, right? So the idea that beautiful architecture is for the wealthy is simply not true historically. And so you're asking the right question, which is, why do we build ugly architecture? And what I think people often don't want to hear is that, and this is what I tell my students, look, it is important to understand that there is a philosophy of the human person behind the kinds of art and architecture that we see today. And where I think young people intuitively grasp this the most is their concerns about all the images on social media and the way that those images can be used to manipulate and create a false sense of a need to buy something or a false sense of competition. Well, why don't we think that public architecture isn't also shaping us or dehumanizing us?
Okay, look, there's just too much here. So this is the end of this show, but we're going to lock the doors and keep you around so that we can do another show because there's so much more to talk about. Margarita Mooney Clayton, thank you, and thank you for the book. The book is The Wounds of Beauty. Hey there, folks. I told you that I would have Margarita Mooney back on the program because I want to talk about her book, The Wounds of Beauty, more than we got to talk about it last time. There's so much to talk about. It's such an important concept. It's called The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education. So, Margarita Mooney Clayton, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
And I want to talk to you again about this central idea that we're putting forth, because this is really the larger thesis, is that God is real. He created us in His image, and we are inescapably created for goodness, truth, and beauty. These are not inessentials or non-essentials. And this atheistic Marxist idea, this modernist idea that we're just animals and we just need the basics. We need food and shelter and that's enough. Beauty doesn't matter. That's a lie. Ultimately, it's a satanic lie. It's a destructive lie, and it's a lie that has come into culture big time, obviously, since the beginning of the 20th century, and it's worked its way through the culture, and it has corroded people's souls. And the only way back is we have to rediscover a vision of goodness, truth, and beauty, and that's really what you and I are talking about, and it's what you get at in your book, The Wounds of Beauty. So I don't know where to start. I guess I want to ask you about, you have 7 dialogues with 7 people in the book, some of whom I know. I know Francis Meyer. You have him, you're talking to him in the book in one of these chapters on the origins of the pessimism in contemporary education and on the power of beauty to cure it. What does he mean by that?
Well, in my discussion with Fran Meyer, we focus a lot on the writings of Sir Roger Scruton. And Roger Scruton was actually a student sort of rebel in the 1960s, but got really turned off by the destruction in the student protests in 1968 across Europe. And so that title is really kind of from one of Scruton's essays called The Uses of Pessimism. And I think the idea that I'm trying to get out with my conversation with Fran Meyer is that human beings are made for the absolute. And any political system that tells you that you can be completely satisfied or completely happy or completely fulfilled in this life is false, right? So what Scruton is saying, what Fran Meyer is saying, is that, look, we need to be pessimistic in the sense of recalling that the world is fallen and that we are by nature incomplete. And any kind of striving that tries to satisfy all of our senses is actually going to end up deepening the void. You know, we've talked a good bit, Eric, about some of the political ideologies that are trying to dissolve beauty in architecture or in art schools. But the other danger is really the kind of endless entertainment that claims to be fulfilling us, whether that's, music or images. And why is that kind of entertainment dangerous? Well, because it's misleading. To the extent that images on social media look so absolutely perfect, then they're not pointing you to something beyond themselves. And so this kind of fake beauty that a lot of people are filling up, like, we have this hunger for beauty. So a lot of people find it through aesthetic consumption of one kind or another. But I picked the title, The Wounds of Beauty, to remind people that true beauty wounds us because it points us to something beyond itself. So just think of the last time you experienced a beautiful sunset or a gorgeous concert, or you were really moved by a piece of art. That true beauty doesn't leave you feeling filled, it leaves you feeling inspired, but it moves you to seek out the source of that beauty.
Actually, we were talking about C.S. Lewis last time. I've been reading a lot of Thomas Howard, who in one of his essays, because there's a new collection of his essays coming out by Ignatius, refers to some famous passages of C.S. Lewis's where he talks about precisely this, that there is something about looking at a glorious landscape, that it's beautiful and satisfying and also frustrating because somehow you want to enter the landscape. You want to become one with the beauty. And that's the promise when we get to heaven. When we're one with God, we become part of the beauty. And of course, Lewis talks about it as Sehnsucht. It's this kind of, you feel an unfulfilled desire that it somehow in its unfulfillment, it's pointing you toward the fulfillment, toward God, toward a greater beauty. The beauty is pointing you to what you're really looking for, and that you can't, as you just said, you cannot be satisfied by, I look at the landscape and I'm filled up. No, I look at the landscape and on the one hand I'm filled up, on the other hand I'm frustrated because I want more of it. I want to know the author of the beauty.
Precisely. You know, Eric, when I was in graduate school at Princeton University studying sociology for my PhD, I split my time between the library, you know, reading all these books on economic development and political history and all this, and the beautiful university chapel. And look, I had my struggles as a young person, like everyone did. You know, people close to me died or people betrayed me. And even though I was going to church and liked the Princeton University chapel is a beautiful place, I still thought that in order to feel better when life was tough, I would just go out with my friends and talk and share everything. And I got a lot of emotional support. Or, you know, we'd go do something fun. Let's just go to the beach, or let's just go to the pool, right? So I sort of tried to drown my sadness with emotional fulfillment. And, you know, it didn't work. Because at the end of those great experiences, there's still this void in you. And so I began to study really the mystical tradition in Christianity, reading people like Edith Stein, who became Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, or Saint Teresa of Avila. And for me, what really changed me was learning the great tradition of Christian contemplative prayer, because there you find an inner peace. And so what I then learned was that this great tradition of contemplative prayer is supposed to prepare you to receive the beautiful things of the world in art, architecture, music, without needing to be filled by them, because you know the source. And you don't know about the source, you know the source, because you're doing this kind of deep prayer that brings you to know God.
That's interesting. I mean, that's a sort of Catholic way of saying what I myself have heard and have said the same thing. That the question is, how do I respond? And the only way really to respond is to be inwardly praising God for the beauty. In other words, it leads you to worship, not to worship the beauty, but to worship the author of the beauty. And that's the only satisfying response. But I've never heard it put that way, and that some of these contemplatives helped you to get there. That's absolutely fascinating.
Well, also, you know, Eric, I was lucky to go on a retreat when I was in graduate school. And so what I realized was that prayer, knowing God through worship and prayer, was the only thing that gives lasting satisfaction. Now, it's not that practicing prayer or worship, you sort of float above everybody else and you have this kind of spiritual ecstasy all the time, but that the great traditions of Christian prayer and worship are there to continuously invite us to this relationship with God. That a relationship with God isn't only about how hard I work and how much I give to others and how many causes I care about, all of which are good things. But the message of Christianity is ultimately that our happiness is in coming to know God. And when I practiced that, then everything else I did in my work and in trying to help other people, I had a sense of the holistic picture, right? That, look, I can't solve all of my friends' problems. I can't solve all the world's problems. We are called to be salt in the world, and we are called to work in the world, but we're not called to be activists in the sense of turning everything into a strategy, because in the end, as I mentioned, this world is fallen and it's broken. So we need that prudential wisdom. And that's why I actually think learning these great traditions of beauty are actually about learning how to live properly in the world. And if we don't educate people for that, and honestly, if our worship is full of a lot of noise, a lot of young people are turning to things like yoga to find that inner peace.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're not finding that inner peace through their own traditions of worship and prayer is a little bit worrisome.
Yeah, and yoga, you can find demons. We'll talk about that on another program, but there's some dark spirituality at the back of that, and we're not kidding around. We have to go to a break, folks. I'm talking to Margarita Mooney Clayton. Make up your mind, Margarita Mooney, the author of The Wounds of Beauty. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Talking to Margarita Mooney about her book. Margarita, it's called The Wounds of Beauty. And again, it's a beautiful and important title, the idea of the wounds of beauty, that it's not about beauty ultimately, but that beauty is important.
That's right. And, one of the other interviews I do in the book, which we haven't talked about yet, is with a woman whose nickname is the Cheese Nun. Now, who is the Cheese Nun? Well, that's what I wanted to know when somebody asked me if I knew her. And so I looked her up, and the Cheese Nun is a Benedictine sister from the Abbey of Regina Laudis in Connecticut, who got a PhD in microbiology from the University of Connecticut and makes artisanal cheeses. And they actually made a documentary about her called The Cheese Nun.
I mean, honestly, I was waiting to ask you about this because it is really, it says one of these people is Sister Noella Marcellino, OSB, on the Benedictine way and its pattern of authentic living as expressed in chant and cheese making. I didn't see that coming.
Well, precisely. So when I wanted to introduce students to these ideas, the first thing I did, I was on the faculty at Yale at the time. I loaded up a group of students, some Catholic, some from a more evangelical Protestant background, and we drove to this monastery to meet the Cheese Nun.
And where in Connecticut is this?
It's Bethlehem, Connecticut. Kind of by Danbury.
You mean Bethel, Connecticut?
No, I think it's Bethlehem.
It's not.
It's not.
I know Bethel. I know. Anyway, it doesn't matter because people can look up Sister Noella Marcellina and find it. But I'm just so fascinated that you actually got to do this.
Right. By the way, she's now moved out to a monastery in Shaw Island in Puget Sound. But at the time, she was in Connecticut. And I've since taken students back there many times. And they make us do agricultural work. So some of my students said, I didn't know nuns used chainsaws. Well, the Benedictines have this committed life of liturgical prayer, the Liturgy of the Hours. Right. They chant all of the Psalms, which, by the way, is a practice that I think a lot of Christians are recovering. In my house, we use the Book of Common Prayer with the Psalms and chant them with our students. But they also work with their hands.
And chainsaws.
It
is the Amish who do not use chainsaws.
Benedictine nuns do. They clear the land.
Yeah.
And they farm.
Do they use backhoes?
They use all the traditional kinds of agricultural tools.
So they don't draw the line at huge hydraulic equipment?
As far as I know, they use any of it.
Okay.
But the point is that Sister Noella, who's been a sister now for 50 years, she had dropped out of, I think it was Sarah Lawrence College, and was a Vietnam War protester, and suddenly felt this deep loss of meaning, and ended up going to a monastery to attend some sort of an event, and discovered what she needed was tradition and authority, and ultimately God. But what I want to do in the book, The Wounds of Beauty, is introduce people a little bit to the Benedictine tradition, because it's both deeply contemplative and it's also incredibly practical. It is about working the land. It's about craft. One of the things happening in our culture is this return to arts and crafts, right? Everybody wants to be an artist and everybody wants to make craft. Well, we are meant to make things. And again, what I think the tradition of beauty in Christianity tells us is that in learning to be a craftsman, we should learn from the greats that came before us, because God has given us the capacity, as I said earlier, to bring order out of chaos. And we have to take the time to slow down and learn the great traditions of beauty. And so one of the other risks that I think we have now is it's almost this idolatry of science or the scientific method, as if somehow the natural world isn't also created by God and revealing God to us and bringing us back. So what Sister Noella says, particularly about cheese making, right? Beautiful cheese, great tasting cheese, comes from fungi. It comes from death, right? So what she says is that we can think analogously about human life and the meaning of creation, death, and resurrection by studying the natural world. So a lot of people are instinctively drawn to beauty through nature, But the Christian tradition doesn't idolize nature because nature decomposes. It's part of its natural cycle. And nature is moving through creation, death, and resurrection, but it's moving back to its creator. And again, I found that when students were able to spend a weekend with me at a Benedictine monastery, or I took some students for a week to a monastery in England and one in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, they're not just reading, they're actually living a different way of life. And then the challenge then becomes how to take these lessons of contemplative prayer, of chanting, manual labor, and live a more integrated, holistic, and happy life.
People are so hungry for this. It's why many people are leaving the church, whatever church they're in, because they know there's got to be more. And this idea of groundedness, that's the term usually that I come up with when we're discussing something like this. What is it about working with your hands? What is it about being close to the land or close to your food sources? What is there about that is somehow unavoidably important? It's fascinating to me that God keeps leading us back. We're created in a way that, if everything becomes digitized, if everything becomes in pill form, if everything is syllogisms, we become less human.
I think there's a lot of humility to be learned through manual labor, and there's a lot of knowledge that's communicated, because in order to take a few different pieces of something and make a great meal, or in order to garden, in order to grow something, you have to learn how to take what's given to us in nature and create a more perfect, a better order out of it. And there's something really fulfilling with that. At the same time, working with nature teaches us our limitations. Nature doesn't bend itself to our pure will somehow.
Well, that's because nature is closely related to this thing we call reality. Nature and nature's God. Man, deep stuff. We'll be right back. Final segment, talking to Margarita Mooney. The book is The Wounds of Beauty. We are talking to Margarita Mooney Clayton. The book is The Wounds of Beauty, and we were just talking off the air about the actual location of this monastery that you visited in Connecticut, in Bethlehem, Connecticut. And we discovered that it's up sort of in the Waterbury area. So if you're in New Haven at Yale, you would feel like it's close to Danbury, but it's not that close to Danbury. But it is, Bethlehem, Connecticut. There are all these little towns that I've never visited in Connecticut. That's one of them. We were talking about cheese making, and we're talking about working with, being co-creators. Now, it's interesting because this is who we are. God created us this way. But in the modern era, we've moved increasingly away from this, as though we could find fulfillment in the digitization of everything, in the reduction in the reduction of everything to these atoms in a way.
Precisely, Eric. Look, what's missing in the modern world of modern philosophy? It's mystery, and it's awe. And what's the beginning of worship? Awe and mystery, right? So I have an article in Comment Magazine, Why Choose Mystery Over Ideology? And what I've been trying to do with these books that I've written and the talks I give and the work I do through Scala Foundation, through our conference on art, the sacred, and the common good, is try to help people in churches and in schools and their homes to have more concrete experiences of beauty through the great traditions of sacred art, through chant, through beautiful music, through working with landscape artists, with architects who are taking what's good in the material world and making it even more beautiful. And when I do this, it teaches people that our world isn't a closed system of us versus them, of the haves and the have-nots. The abundance of the earth has been far from being developed in its fullest form. God gave us the capacity to take the material forms of the world and create better things that we can share with other people. But yet we live in a time of ideology, which is a reduction of reality to a one-dimensional way of thinking, which we've honed in on here, is the materialist way, that we're ultimately nothing but a bundle of desires for food or for sex or for power or for glory. Look, the Romantics even turned our emotions into nothing but uncontrolled instincts with no order. And this goes against the Christian tradition, which has tried to take our instincts and our passions and direct them to make them become part of this unfolding mystery. So ideology is a closed system. It's reductionistic. It pits people, us versus them. And mystery tells us that, yes, we have certainty and we have truth, but that God's creative capacities and God's inspiration is still speaking in this time, and we can know with certainty that we're moving towards that by learning traditions and by opening our hearts to receive the gifts from God and praising Him.
It's so fascinating because this can go wrong in both directions, and I'm literally these days reading. I mentioned Thomas Howard, but his first book, it's called Christ the Tiger, and he deals with this. Now it's dated in a way because he wrote it in 1967, but it's him coming out of a sort of a dogmatic, I would say somewhat fundamentalist Protestant background, and beginning to say, how does this dogma bring me into the world? How do I deal with the world? And it's fascinating because it's not to say that dogma or theology or rules aren't important, but if you over-focus on that, you end up making an idol of these wonderful things, which is the opposite of God, which is the antithesis of worshiping God. So how do we maintain that balance so that all these good things lead us not to themselves but to God? And that's it's kind of a lifelong project. But dealing with mystery, Alice von Hildebrand, whom I interviewed at Socrates in the City about 8 years ago, I think she talks about that and about womanhood and what is veiled and mysterious and the sacred. And that obviously is something we've lost dramatically. We've run from in our culture. We don't understand mystery and beauty and veiling the sacred. We don't get that, and that's part of this conversation.
Precisely. We live in a culture that's really been disenchanted, and it's been cut off from the sacred. But I will say, from my teaching and from my working with school teachers and church leaders, that beauty still speaks to the human heart. So what we're trying to do through Scala Foundation as a follow-up to this book, we're partnering with associations of classical liberal arts schools in K-12, like Great Hearts Academies, Institute for Catholic Liberal Education, Society for Classical Learning, great organizations of parents, concerned people who are trying to take back education and ground it again on the great traditions of philosophy, theology, arts, literature, music. Yet still, educators and I think families struggle with time, right? You mentioned earlier that, look, if we're going to get serious about beauty, we have to set aside time for worship, for leisure, and contemplation. And that requires all of us to sacrifice something of our other desires, something of our lower desires, right? But I see a tremendous interest in young people who, when they see a beautiful painting of Our Lady with the child Jesus, they can't help but look. And when you present young people with beautiful, harmonious music, it moves them, right? And so despite the fact that we've lost in our culture a sense of the sacred, I still see time and again that beauty moves people, and that's why it pierces through ideology.
Yeah, and there's no way to escape it. As long as you are a human being, you've been programmed by the one who made you to long for these things, to turn to these things.
That's right.
We've just got 30 seconds left. Scala Foundation, what is the website? And tell us very briefly, if you don't mind, about the Scala Foundation.
Scala Foundation's website is scalafoundation.org. Its mission is to renew American culture through liberal arts education, beauty, and worship. You can find out about our recent conference where we do a series of talks on art, the sacred, and the common good, where we uplift artists who are making great music and great art for today. You can find those videos on Scala's YouTube site, and you can find resources for parents, families, and educators on Scala's website about practical ways to live this out in the home and in schools.
Scala is SCALA, Scala Foundation. Margarita Mooney, thank you for your time. The book is The Wounds of Beauty. Just a joy to have you back.
Thank you, Eric.
Folks, this is your daily reminder to please go to mypillow.com or mystore.com. And to get huge savings, use the code ERIC. If you don't believe me, here's some celebrity friends.
Mama said to use the code ERIC.
Use the code ERIC.
Eric.
Thank you.